Within the highly optimized architecture of modern political combat, certain public figures operate less as individual human beings and more as meticulously engineered corporate brands. The operational parameters of these brands are established long before they enter a federal hearing room. Gavin Newsom, occupying the position of governor, arrived at the witness table inside the House chamber exhibiting the exact physical posture of an individual who had been aggressively preparing for this specific temporal coordinate since the absolute beginning of his conscious political life. He was structurally recognized as the primary Democratic frontrunner for the 2028 presidential cycle. He formally represented the administrative apparatus of the fifth largest economy on the planet. The acoustic and visual environment of the joint session regarding the federal oversight of state fraud and mismanagement was operating at maximum capacity. The physical gallery was entirely saturated with observers. The designated press sector was restricted to standing room only, transmitting the feed across every major broadcast network. The political intelligence apparatus recognized the underlying physics of the event. The leading candidate for the next presidential cycle was physically positioned across from the exact individual he would mathematically be required to defeat. The primary audition for the executive branch of the United States had officially initiated. Newsom's mechanical execution of this audition was flawless. He possessed a highly calibrated biological presentation. The architectural styling of his hair, the precise tailoring of his suit, and the strictly modulated frequency of his California baritone combined to create an audio-visual output resembling a professional podcast host who had successfully acquired a governorship. For a span of 7 years, his entire political identity had been mathematically constructed to function as the exact inverse of Donald Trump. He was algorithmically designed to project extreme institutional polish wherever Trump projected roughness, to maintain absolute vocal calm wherever Trump deployed volume, and to represent systemic order wherever Trump introduced operational chaos. This stark binary contrast was not merely a component of his campaign. It functioned as the entirety of his foundational argument for occupying the presidency. Operating under the glare of 40 separate broadcast lenses, Newsom deployed a highly calculated rhetorical strike. He did not rely on standard legislative vocabulary. He engaged his microphone and directed his vocal output squarely at the podium. He explicitly categorized the former president as a convicted felon. He stated for the official record that the previous administration had actively violated a higher volume of court orders within an 18-month window than any other presidency in the documented history of the republic. He accused Trump of physically dismantling the East Wing of the White House for the purpose of constructing a ballroom. Finally, he delivered the terminal classification, labeling his opponent an invasive species operating within the ecosystem of American democracy. He proceeded to establish his own defensive perimeter using massive macroeconomic variables. He reminded the chamber that his state contained 40 million residents. He cited global leadership metrics in the sectors of advanced technology, industrial agriculture, commercial entertainment, and renewable energy infrastructure. He concluded his opening sequence by declaring that he fundamentally refused to be lectured regarding the mechanics of governance by an individual possessing a historical record of bankrupting commercial casinos. The acoustic reaction within the chamber immediately fractured. The Democratic alignment generated a wave of supportive audio. In the secondary seating tier, the governor's operational staff initiated a silent, synchronized exchange. It was the specific, highly recognizable micro-expression that political operatives display only when their principal asset successfully executes a pre-written ballistic trajectory exactly as it was rehearsed. However, the structural reality existing immediately beneath that polished rhetorical surface was catastrophically unstable. The individual actively broadcasting his command over the fifth largest economy on earth was simultaneously presiding over the most massive systemic unemployment fraud event ever recorded in the history of the United States. A mathematically verified sum of $31 billion had been successfully extracted from his state apparatus by convicted criminals. active death row inmates, and highly organized international syndicates operating out of Russia, China, and Romania. Furthermore, his own primary administrative officer, his chief of staff, was currently positioned under active federal indictment for manipulating financial records to classify a $15,000 Chanel handbag as a legitimate business expense. At the central podium, President Donald J. Trump absorbed the opening statement. He did not activate his standard operational protocols. He remained completely silent throughout the duration of the governor's attack. In the highly reactive ecosystem of Washington oversight hearings, silence is frequently interpreted as a biological failure to process incoming fire. But this specific absence of audio was distinct. Trump was not engaging in nervous physical adjustments. He was not attempting to distract himself by interacting with a mobile device. He exhibited the absolute unyielding stillness of a predator that has made a conscious tactical decision to allow its target to exhaust all available ammunition. He understood the fundamental physics of the room. Allowing the polished governor to talk first would exponentially magnify the kinetic impact of what was going to happen next. As the acoustic echo of Newsom's casino remark faded into the paneling of the chamber, Trump engaged a highly localized facial movement. It was a private, contained smile. It was the exact identical expression he had utilized during previous forensic deconstructions. He leaned forward, approaching the microphone. He did not match the governor's elevated baritone. He dropped his volume, forcing the room to quiet itself in order to receive the transmission. Governor Trump stated, his tone devoid of theatrical outrage. Beautiful speech, really beautiful. He paused, allowing the false validation to hang suspended over the witness table for a fraction of a second before systematically collapsing the ceiling. You should see the economy you're running, though. With mechanical precision, Trump reached his right hand toward the surface of the podium. He made physical contact with a document enclosure. He opened the folder featuring the gold tab. The performance of the polished anti-Trump had officially concluded. The forensic audit of the California apparatus was about to begin. The opening of the gold tab folder signaled a permanent shift in the operational parameters of the hearing. President Trump did not engage with Governor Newsom's macroeconomic defense regarding the fifth largest economy on earth. In the strict discipline of forensic auditing, arguing over massive abstract global metrics is a highly inefficient deployment of time. The most effective method of dismantling a large-scale political narrative is to introduce a highly localized, mathematically verified systemic failure. Trump directed his visual focus to the initial document and introduced the central metric of the audit, $31 billion. He read the number with the deliberate, unyielding patience of an individual who intimately understands that massive integers require physical time to properly settle into the acoustic space of a room. He established the chronological parameters during the years 2020 and 2021. The California Employment Development Department, the specific state agency operating under the direct executive authority of the governor, systematically dispersed an estimated $31 billion in entirely fraudulent unemployment claims. Trump did not merely state the number, he mathematically categorized it. He informed the committee that this specific operational failure represented the largest single instance of unemployment fraud in the documented history of the United States government. I'm a businessman, Governor Trump stated, maintaining a cadence that was entirely devoid of theatrical anger. I've made a lot of money, more than most people can imagine, but I've never lost $31 billion. Nobody has. He paused, allowing the sheer scale of the financial destruction to isolate the governor. That's not a scandal, Trump concluded, lowering his vocal register. That's a record. You hold the record for the largest fraud loss in the history of the American government. Congratulations. At the witness table, Newsom's primary defensive architecture engaged. His jaw tightened. It was not a massive, uncontrolled clenching of muscle. It was the highly professional, minimal tightening utilized by individuals who have spent decades operating in hostile public environments, recognizing that absolute facial control is the foundational requirement of political survival. However, The high-definition lenses positioned at the podium level successfully captured the microscopic physiological adjustment. Trump advanced the forensic timeline, transitioning from the aggregate sum to the specific identities of the recipients. He noted that exactly $1 billion of the total fraudulent dispersal had been systematically transferred to incarcerated individuals. People actively housed within the California state prison system operating under the direct supervision of the state government were successfully receiving federal and state unemployment checks. Trump then isolated a single name to maximize the kinetic impact of the data. He explicitly requested the committee's attention before stating that the list of taxpayer-funded beneficiaries included Scott Peterson, a convicted murderer currently residing on California's death row for the killing of his pregnant wife, had successfully navigated the state's administrative apparatus to collect unemployment benefits. The acoustic response from the gallery was instantaneous. It was not standard political laughter, nor was it a theatrical gasp of shock. It was the specific, highly uncomfortable sound a collective group of humans generates when a verified fact is fundamentally too obscene to process cleanly. Newsom's hands, the heavily rehearsed, perfectly manicured hands that had spent 30 years executing the fluid, confident gestures of California leadership, shifted their physical position on the mahogany table. The right hand slowly migrated to cover the left. The motion was not dramatic, but the slow interlocking of the fingers functioned as a clear biological indicator. The governor's central nervous system was initiating a microscopic retreat into self-protection. Trump systematically layered the absurdity. He introduced the existence of a Memphis-based rapper operating under the stage name Nuke Bizzle, who had actively produced and published a music video on YouTube. The digital media explicitly featured the artist displaying massive stacks of physical cash, openly bragging about successfully scamming the California EDD program. Trump noted that the administrative apparatus of the fifth largest economy on earth entirely failed to notice the public broadcast of this theft until federal investigators independently flagged the video. He then mapped the international perimeter of the operational collapse. Organized crime syndicates actively operating from Russia, China, and Romania had successfully penetrated the state's defenses. Foreign nationals maintaining zero physical footprint within the state of California, who had never contributed a single hour of labor to the American economy, were systematically extracting capital from the state treasury. Trump identified the specific administrative mechanism that enabled the breach. He cited a United States Senate Committee on Finance determination regarding Julie Su, the California Labor Secretary. The federal audit confirmed that Su had explicitly waived basic foundational fact-checking and fraud prevention requirements, operating in direct contradiction to established Department of Labor guidance. The rules were not accidentally bypassed. They were administratively dismantled by the executive branch. Trump entered a final expert testimony into the record. He quoted Haywood Talcove, the CEO of LexisNexis Risk Solutions, who stated on the record that he had actively begged federal and state officials to halt the dispersals, warning them in advance that it would result in the largest fraud event in American history. The warnings were explicitly ignored. Newsom recognized that the structural integrity of his brand was sustaining critical damage. He leaned toward his microphone to initiate a countermeasure. Mr. President, Newsom began utilizing his modulated baritone. The EDD situation was a national. Trump did not pause. He did not acknowledge the vocalization. He did not elevate his volume to overpower the interruption. He simply maintained his slow, relentless presidential cadence, completely occupying the acoustic space as if the governor had never spoken. It was a demonstration of absolute dominance, the mechanical reality of a loud man deciding to be dangerously quiet. Newsom's sentence hung suspended in the air, permanently unfinished. The vocal trajectory had been aiming for the phrase national problem that affected every state, but it was violently denied its destination. The physical mechanics of the governor's face executed a rapid calculation, his lips pressed tightly together. It was the biological response of an individual attempting to decide whether to aggressively re-engage the microphone or abandon the rhetorical strike entirely. Newsom abandoned the sentence. The abandonment materialized as a micro-exhale pushed through his nasal cavity. It was the physical release of oxygen that had been biologically gathered to project words that the room would now never hear. To seal the perimeter, Trump introduced the ultimate institutional insult. He detailed the case of Phyllis Hope Stitt, a California EDD employee personally hired and authorized to determine benefit eligibility and stop fraudulent claims. She subsequently pleaded guilty to defrauding the exact program she was contracted to protect, stealing $750,000. He paired this with Letitia Mariscal, a county worker charged with embezzling $40,000 in food stamps directly from the state's most vulnerable population. Trump concluded the sequence with a quote from California Assemblyman David Tangapa, explicitly identifying a pervasive culture of corruption originating directly from the top of the Sacramento leadership architecture. At that precise moment, the biological shielding of the governor experienced a verified breach. Newsom's neck, the specific strip of skin located between his starched collar and his heavily maintained jawline, an area unprotected by television makeup, began to change temperature. The dilation of the capillaries was not a bright red flash of embarrassment. It was a slow, subtle warming triggered by a massive spike in internal blood pressure. The conscious mind of the governor was still projecting absolute control, but his vascular system was actively transmitting a completely different reality to 20 million high-definition screens. The $31 billion audit had successfully bypassed the polish, and it was now operating deep inside the machine. The forensic audit now required a fundamental shift in trajectory. President Trump deliberately closed the perimeter on the $31 billion of external criminal theft and transitioned directly to the internal architecture of the governor's personal conduct. He stated a specific chronological coordinate, the 6th of November 2020. Trump delivered this date with the exact mechanical precision of a prosecutor who has been patiently waiting to enter a lethal piece of evidence into the public record. He established the dual realities occurring on that specific day. In the macro environment, the governor was utilizing the full authority of the state to order 40 million citizens to cancel their Thanksgiving gatherings under the strict threat of legal penalty. Simultaneously, in the micro environment, the governor was physically occupying a seat at the French Laundry restaurant located in Napa Valley. Trump itemized the specific variables of this secondary reality. 12 guests, a baseline cost of $350 per person, zero facial masking, zero social distancing protocols, and crucially, the event was executed entirely indoors. To validate the structural truth of these variables, Trump extracted a physical photograph from the gold-tabbed folder and elevated it for the committee to observe. The image was simultaneously broadcast across the high-definition monitors positioned throughout the hearing room. The visual evidence was absolute. Newsom was captured sitting shoulder to shoulder with his guests. The governor's office had previously issued formal statements to the press claiming the dinner was legally compliant because it occurred outdoors. Trump utilized the photograph originally obtained by a Los Angeles television network to surgically dismantle that narrative. The image explicitly displayed heavy sliding glass doors. Trump noted that according to witness testimony, those specific doors had been pulled completely shut to acoustically isolate the party because they were generating an excessive amount of noise. The acoustic environment of the hearing room fundamentally changed. The gallery produced sustained, unified laughter. It was the highly specific rhythm that Trump is uniquely capable of generating, a frequency where verified facts are delivered as comedy, and the comedy operates as undeniable evidence, seamlessly blending until the target is trapped inside the overlap. In response to this acoustic assault, Governor Newsom deployed his primary biological defense mechanism. He attempted to smile. This was not an involuntary reaction. It was the heavily polished, camera-ready debate stage expression that had successfully protected him through 7 years of governing the most heavily scrutinized state in the nation. It was a weaponized smile designed to communicate absolute control and the specific California confidence that silently broadcasted, "I am entirely above this." However, the mathematics of the room had shifted. The practiced smile collided directly with the physical wave of laughter actively directed at him. This specific collision produced a catastrophic failure within the governor's facial architecture. The high-definition lenses captured a micro-expression. It did not register as a confident smile, nor did it register as a defeated grimace. It materialized as the agonizing transitional state trapped directly between the two. It was the visible biological artifact of a man whose facial muscles were receiving direct orders from his brain to project casual amusement, while his central nervous system was simultaneously attempting to process overwhelming public humiliation. The two conflicting commands fought for physical control over the exact same set of facial muscles. The glitch lasted for less than a single second. But within the unyielding memory of a C-SPAN broadcast, 1 second is permanent. That specific fractured frame the governor's face suspended in a state of biological paralysis while the room laughed was instantly cemented as the defining visual artifact of the hearing. Trump did not pause to allow the governor to recover. He tightened the mechanical vise. He identified the other individuals occupying the table in the photograph. Newsom was physically seated next to Dustin Corcoran, the chief executive officer of the California Medical Association. This was the exact medical organization actively advising the state government to issue the severe lockdown restrictions. Positioned immediately next to the CEO was the association's top lobbyist, Janice Norman. Trump translated the visual data into a brutal operational reality. The sitting governor, the chief executive of the Medical Association, and the primary medical lobbyist, the three specific individuals most directly responsible for engineering the policies that were keeping 40 million Californians locked inside their homes, were sitting shoulder to shoulder, breathing recycled indoor air without masks, at an establishment that charges $350 before pouring the wine. Trump contrasted this elite gathering with Maria from Fresno, a citizen who spent that exact same evening sitting alone in her residence simply because she trusted her governor's directives. At the witness table, Newsom's right hand initiated a slow, deliberate movement. He reached for his designated water glass, elevated it, consumed a measured amount of liquid, and returned the glass to the table. The physical action was heavily controlled, designed to simulate the appearance of a man who is merely hydrating. But in the forensic environment of a federal hearing, drinking water is fundamentally a biological tell. A politician operating in a state of comfort does not require artificial hydration at minute 22 of an inquiry. A man who requires water at minute 22 is a man whose salivary glands have completely shut down due to acute internal stress. Trump delivered the final blow to this segment by quoting the Sacramento Bee, the state's own paper of record. He read their exact editorial phrasing, "Haute cuisine, hypocrisy." He read their conclusion that absolutely nothing would successfully launder the permanent stain of stupidity from the governor's reputation. By the time Trump finished reading the quote, the Newsom smile had completely evaporated. It was abandoned. What remained on the C-SPAN feed was the governor's neutral resting face. But on an individual whose entire political brand was constructed upon the foundation of polished charm, a neutral expression mathematically registers as an absence. The charm had officially evacuated the perimeter. The facial architecture that remained was competent, highly composed, and entirely empty. It was the face of a corporate product whose signature logo had just been forcibly removed, leaving an individual desperately waiting for his internal systems to locate a viable replacement. The complete evaporation of the governor's trademark smile signaled the conclusion of the behavioral phase of the audit. President Trump had successfully dismantled the public brand by utilizing the visual evidence of the French Laundry dinner. However, personal hypocrisy, while politically damaging, is rarely sufficient to terminate a presidential ambition. To execute a terminal strike, the forensic focus must transition from the hypocrisy of personal conduct to the mathematical corruption of state legislation. Trump physically turned a page within the Gold Tab folder, advancing the chronological timeline of the hearing to the year 2023. He initiated the sequence by reciting the public branding of a massive economic policy. He noted that the governor had officially signed a highly publicized piece of legislation mathematically raising the minimum wage for fast food workers to $20 per hour. Trump recalled the specific rhetorical vocabulary the governor had deployed during the signing ceremony. The legislation was publicly marketed as a fundamental matter of basic fairness and human dignity. It was presented to the California electorate as a moral imperative to ensure that the individuals physically flipping burgers and mopping floors possess the financial capacity to survive within the state's hyperinflated economy. Having established the moral architecture of the law, Trump immediately proceeded to examine its structural code. He informed the committee that deeply embedded within the complex legislative text was a highly specific surgical exemption. He read the exact legal parameter into the acoustic space of the room. The $20 minimum wage requirement would legally not apply to any restaurant that produced for sale bread as a standalone menu item. Trump allowed the absurdity of that specific linguistic parameter to hang suspended over the mahogany desk. In the rigid mechanics of state governance, an exemption based entirely on the independent sale of baked carbohydrates does not represent standard economic policy. It represents a highly targeted geographical coordinate. It is a legal loophole engineered with the exact precision of a laser-guided munition. He locked his visual focus directly onto the witness and identified the target coordinate. The exemption was explicitly designed for Panera Bread. Trump then mapped the financial and personal overlap that transformed this bizarre legal phrasing into a verified transactional receipt. He introduced a new variable into the equation, a man named Greg Flynn. He mathematically defined Flynn's operational status. Flynn was the single largest Panera Bread franchisee currently operating within the United States. The audit then moved into the financial ledgers. Trump read the numbers with absolute unyielding flatness. Greg Flynn had systematically donated a verified minimum of $164,800 directly to Gavin Newsom's political campaigns. To ensure the perimeter of the relationship was entirely sealed, Trump introduced the secondary business overlap. He documented that Flynn had recently acquired a massive luxury resort located in the Napa Valley. The specific hospitality firm officially contracted to manage that newly acquired resort was owned by the governor. Trump synthesized the data into a brutal three-part classification. Greg Flynn is your donor, your business partner, and your friend, he stated, the cadence landing like heavy stones dropping onto a wooden floor. He exposed the mechanical process utilized to insert the loophole. The exemption was not debated in public committee. It was not drafted by the original author of the legislation. It was crafted in absolute secrecy, operating exclusively at the highest executive altitude of the governor's office, specifically for the financial benefit of the donor. The mathematical outcome was undeniable. The vast majority of the fast food industry was legally forced to absorb the massive $20 hourly labor cost, while the governor's personal friend was fundamentally shielded from it. Trump then deployed the governor's own defensive vocabulary against him. He noted that when the press eventually discovered the structural anomaly and confronted the administration, Newsom had casually dismissed the highly lucrative legal manipulation as simply being part of the sausage making. The deployment of that specific localized political slang inside the severe acoustic environment of a federal oversight hearing sounded grotesque. It successfully translated massive state corruption into a flippant, arrogant joke. At the witness table, the biological architecture of the governor experienced its second documented catastrophic failure. His left hand detached from its protected interlocked position, resting securely on the center of the desk. The hand migrated laterally toward the hard physical edge of the table and forcefully gripped the wood. This was fundamentally not a polished theatrical gesture. In the science of human kinesiology, a sudden, white-knuckled grip on a stationary object indicates that the central nervous system has received a critical internal distress signal and is instinctively searching for a physical anchor to prevent a collapse. The high-definition camera zoomed in on the biological truth. The skin stretched tightly over the knuckles of the left hand, visibly whitened, drained of blood by the sheer mechanical force of the clench. The physical grip lasted for precisely 2 seconds. After that microscopic window of time, the conscious mind of the governor recognized the visual liability of the action. The fingers slowly released their mechanical pressure, and the hand retreated back to its original, carefully curated position. But in the unblinking reality of the C-SPAN feed, those 2 seconds had successfully transmitted a devastating diagnostic report to the entire nation. The grip officially communicated that the biological organism residing beneath the tailored suit and the perfect hair was no longer operating on the fuel of political polish. The public brand had been entirely bypassed. The man sitting in the chair was now operating exclusively on the raw, unfiltered chemistry of adrenaline. The forensic audit of the California administrative architecture had successfully established the financial parameters of the governor's personal conduct and the calculated nature of the legislative exemptions. However, the ultimate verification of a systemic institutional failure is found in the operational integrity of the individuals physically positioned within the governor's inner circle. If the executive branch functions as a machine, the chief of staff acts as the primary gear regulating the flow of capital, personnel, and accountability. Senator Kennedy physically extracted the next file from the manila folder, transitioning the audit from the governor's personal policy decisions to the verified criminal reality of his office. He initiated the segment by establishing the operational status of Dana Williamson, the individual who served as Newsom's primary chief of staff. He described her physical and professional position, the person situated directly outside the governor's door, the person who managed the daily operational schedule, and the person tasked with the execution of the governor's governing philosophy. Kennedy read the specific legal reality into the record. In November 2025, a federal grand jury formally indicted Dana Williamson on multiple counts of public corruption. He did not allow the term public corruption to remain a vague political allegation. He mechanically itemized the specific findings of the federal indictment. The legal document alleged that Williamson, in coordination with 4 primary co-conspirators, had systematically funneled $225,000 out of a dormant campaign account, effectively converting political capital into private liquidity. Furthermore, she was officially accused of systematically falsifying federal tax documentation, claiming over $1.7 million in entirely fraudulent business expenses. Kennedy deployed a highly effective forensic tactic. He did not summarize these expenses as a dry total. He extracted the specific line items from the indictment and recited them into the hearing room, maintaining a cadence of absolute clinical detachment. A $15,000 Chanel bag listed as a business expense, Kennedy stated. The acoustic response from the gallery was an immediate involuntary burst of laughter. It was not the laughter of a joke. It was the laughter of pure, documented absurdity. The specific cognitive dissonance of a high-level government official attempting to justify a luxury fashion accessory as a necessary tool of state governance triggered a reflex that the room could not suppress. Kennedy continued the recitation, refusing to grant the audience time to process the absurdity of the handbag, a chartered private jet, business expense. More laughter. The sound was becoming synchronized, a collective recognition that the criminality was occurring in the plain light of day, documented in tax filings that the governor's administration had ostensibly verified. a $170,000 birthday trip to Mexico, business expense. The sustained nature of the gallery's response confirmed that the barrier between comedy and criminality had been permanently dissolved. The audience was no longer reacting to a political attack. They were witnessing the mechanical dissection of a corrupt lifestyle financed directly by the public trust. Trump allowed the laughter to subside, then injected the lethal forensic connection. He noted that Williamson was also formally accused of falsifying legal documentation to illegally obtain pandemic relief funds intended for public assistance to capitalize her own private business enterprise. He leaned into the microphone. Governor, your chief of staff stole pandemic money, the exact same pandemic money your state lost $31 billion of. She stole from the money that was already being stolen. The moral weight of that specific realization silenced the room entirely. The realization that the state's emergency relief funds were being simultaneously drained by international crime syndicates, and the governor's own chief of staff fundamentally destroyed any remaining administrative credibility of the administration. Trump referenced the official statement Newsom had released upon Williamson's resignation. He quoted the governor's own words, "I will miss her insight, tenacity, and big heart." He paused, letting the sentimental language hang in the room for a full 3 seconds. Governor, you missed more than her big heart. You missed her big expense reports. This specific line generated the loudest, most sustained laughter of the entire hearing. It erupted from both sides of the aisle. The political alignment of the participants became irrelevant because the line was constructed with the surgical precision required to force an involuntary reflex. The humor was not derived from a clever political jab. It was derived from the absolute verifiable absurdity of the governor's public endorsement of a woman who was currently under federal indictment for embezzling from the very people he governed. At the witness table, Newsom's physical containment protocol had officially collapsed. The signature polished smile that had been his primary political tool since the recall attempt had been completely retired. His face was now locked into a neutral, vacant position. It was the biological equivalent of a professional boxer who had sustained too much cranial trauma and had decided to simply cover up and wait for the bell to end the round. He was absorbing immense structural damage without providing the gallery with the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. But the cameras, which had been trained on his facial geometry since the commencement of the hearing, were documenting a reality that the governor's conscious mind could no longer control. He was no longer a performing politician. He was an individual enduring a public forensic dissection of his entire administrative tenure. He sat motionless, absorbing the factual recitation of his chief of staff's criminal behavior, while the federal record permanently documented that the corruption was not an isolated event occurring in a distant branch of the government. It was occurring directly outside the governor's office door, managed by the person he trusted with his entire public legacy. Trump did not raise his voice to conclude the segment. He simply set the indictment summary down on the mahogany desk, adding it to the growing pile of verified failures. The message was perfectly clear. The collapse of the governor's administration was not a victimless administrative error. It was a pervasive internal culture of systemic abuse that had physically touched every single aspect of the state's executive leadership. The structural dissection of the California administrative apparatus had successfully navigated the corruption of the chief of staff and the personal hypocrisy of the governor's lockdown enforcement. However, the most lethal component of the forensic audit remained the objective examination of the governor's signature policy achievements. Senator Kennedy initiated this segment by transitioning the evidentiary focus from criminal indictments to the cold, undeniable failure of state-level program implementation. He removed his optical glasses, placing them carefully on the mahogany surface, and extracted the official state auditor's report for the fiscal year 2024. He did not introduce this document with political hyperbole. He read the raw quantitative data into the official record, allowing the scale of the failure to physically dominate the acoustic space of the hearing room. Kennedy established that the Newsom administration had formally allocated and spent $24 billion on statewide programs explicitly designed to alleviate the homelessness crisis. He stated the number with absolute measured flatness, $24 billion. He then introduced the auditor's core finding. Despite the massive infusion of capital, the state administration had entirely failed to establish the internal mechanisms required to track the efficacy of the spending. The auditor could not verify whether the funds had been utilized to successfully house a single individual, nor could they verify if the programs had achieved any of their stated objectives. Kennedy deployed a devastating forensic contrast. He noted that during the exact time frame when the administration was consuming $24 billion of taxpayer capital, the documented population of homeless individuals within the state of California had demonstrably increased. The state had achieved the singular catastrophic distinction of spending more money on homelessness than any individual state in the entire history of the American Union, while simultaneously presiding over a higher volume of individuals living on the street. He then pivoted from the general budgetary failure to the governor's specific campaign promise. He retrieved the documentation of Newsom's signature housing pledge, the formal public commitment to facilitate the construction of 3.5 million new residential units by the year 2025. Kennedy compared the pledge against the verified reality. As of the year 2025, the total number of actual residential units constructed under the governor's housing plan amounted to 640,000. He looked directly at the witness and asked for a status update on this specific performance gap. Newsom, maintaining his composure with mechanical intensity, characterized the 3.5 million unit target as a stretch goal. Trump did not register surprise. He registered the exact mechanical utility of the phrase. He immediately translated the governor's political vocabulary into its industrial equivalent. Stretch goal, Trump repeated, his voice dropping into a register that signaled the beginning of the final demolition. Governor, in the private sector, when a contractor promises to build 3.5 million homes and delivers 640,000, we don't call that a stretch goal. We call that a breach of contract. We call that fraud. The characterization of the governor's signature housing promise as fraud functioned as a structural pivot point for the entire hearing. It successfully redefined the governor's public identity from a competent, modern executive into a failed commercial actor who had systematically deceived his own constituents regarding the physical delivery of public infrastructure. Trump maintained the pressure, introducing the finding that 7 individual state agencies were currently formally labeled as high risk for waste, fraud, and severe mismanagement under the Newsom administration. He explicitly noted that this represented the highest concentration of high-risk operational designations in the entire history of the California governorship. He physically turned the page of the folder, moving from the macro failure of the state government to the individual human cost of the administration's operational paralysis. He introduced the specific case study of Maria, a business owner from Fresno who had operated a successful nail salon with 23 employees for nearly 2 decades. During the mandatory state lockdowns, Maria had been forced to terminate her operations. She initiated the application process for the state's unemployment relief program for herself and her staff. Trump described the systemic collapse. The state's EDD website was permanently offline, the phone lines were chronically busy, and every attempt to secure basic relief was blocked by technical glitches, frozen accounts, and administrative incompetence. Trump detailed the timeline of the failure. Maria attempted to resolve the issue every single day for 3 weeks. In that exact same time frame, the state's administrative apparatus, the identical agency that was leaving Maria's phone calls unanswered, was successfully processing unemployment checks for Scott Peterson on death row. She lost the salon. 23 people lost their jobs, Trump stated. She moved to Texas. She told me California didn't work for people like me anymore. She started over in Houston because the state you run, the 5th largest economy on earth, couldn't answer a phone call from a woman who had been paying her taxes for 19 years. At the witness table, the governor's physical composure was officially undergoing a transition from disciplined control to visible liability. The composure, which had successfully functioned as a political asset for 7 years, now communicated a terrifying, lethal distance from the reality of the people he had been elected to serve. The governor's silent refusal to acknowledge the human cost of his administrative failure transformed his composure into an act of insult. The room recognized that he was not maintaining his posture because he was confident in his governance. He was maintaining it because he possessed no alternative operational state. He was a product of a political machine designed to generate polish, and now that the machine had been audited, there was nothing left behind the glass except for the terrifying mechanical reality of an individual who did not understand and fundamentally did not care that the state he claimed to manage had become operationally insolvent for the people who performed the actual work. The forensic audit of the California administrative architecture had successfully established the financial parameters of the governor's personal conduct and the calculated nature of the legislative exemptions. However, the ultimate verification of a systemic institutional failure is found in the operational integrity of the individuals physically positioned within the governor's inner circle. If the executive branch functions as a machine, the chief of staff acts as the primary gear regulating the flow of capital, personnel, and accountability. Senator Kennedy physically extracted the next file from the manila folder, transitioning the audit from the governor's personal policy decisions to the verified criminal reality of his office. He initiated the segment by establishing the operational status of Dana Williamson, the individual who served as Newsom's primary chief of staff. He described her physical and professional position, the person situated directly outside the governor's door, the person who managed the daily operational schedule, and the person tasked with the execution of the governor's governing philosophy. Kennedy read the specific legal reality into the record. In November 2025, a federal grand jury formally indicted Dana Williamson on multiple counts of public corruption. He did not allow the term public corruption to remain a vague political allegation. He mechanically itemized the specific findings of the federal indictment. The legal document alleged that Williamson, in coordination with 4 primary co-conspirators, had systematically funneled $225,000 out of a dormant campaign account, effectively converting political capital into private liquidity. Furthermore, she was officially accused of systematically falsifying federal tax documentation, claiming over $1.7 million in entirely fraudulent business expenses. Kennedy deployed a highly effective forensic tactic. He did not summarize these expenses as a dry total. He extracted the specific line items from the indictment and recited them into the hearing room, maintaining a cadence of absolute clinical detachment. A $15,000 Chanel bag listed as a business expense, Kennedy stated. The acoustic response from the gallery was an immediate, involuntary burst of laughter. It was not the laughter of a joke. It was the laughter of pure, documented absurdity. The specific cognitive dissonance of a high-level government official attempting to justify a luxury fashion accessory as a necessary tool of state governance triggered a reflex that the room could not suppress. Kennedy continued the recitation, refusing to grant the audience time to process the absurdity of the handbag, a chartered private jet, business expense, more laughter. The sound was becoming synchronized, a collective recognition that the criminality was occurring in the plain light of day, documented in tax filings that the governor's administration had ostensibly verified. A $170,000 birthday trip to Mexico, business expense. The sustained nature of the gallery's response confirmed that the barrier between comedy and criminality had been permanently dissolved. The audience was no longer reacting to a political attack. They were witnessing the mechanical dissection of a corrupt lifestyle financed directly by the public trust. Trump allowed the laughter to subside, then injected the lethal forensic connection. He noted that Williamson was also formally accused of falsifying legal documentation to illegally obtain pandemic relief funds intended for public assistance to capitalize her own private business enterprise. He leaned into the microphone, "Governor, your chief of staff stole pandemic money, the exact same pandemic money your state lost $31 billion of She stole from the money that was already being stolen. The moral weight of that specific realization silenced the room entirely. The realization that the state's emergency relief funds were being simultaneously drained by international crime syndicates, and the governor's own chief of staff fundamentally destroyed any remaining administrative credibility of the administration. Trump referenced the official statement Newsom had released upon Williamson's resignation. He quoted the governor's own words, "I will miss her insight, tenacity, and big heart." He paused, letting the sentimental language hang in the room for a full 3 seconds. "Governor, you missed more than her big heart. You missed her big expense reports." This specific line generated the loudest, most sustained laughter of the entire hearing. It erupted from both sides of the aisle. The political alignment of the participants became irrelevant because the line was constructed with the surgical precision required to force an involuntary reflex. The humor was not derived from a clever political jab. It was derived from the absolute, verifiable absurdity of the governor's public endorsement of a woman who was currently under federal indictment for embezzling from the very people he governed. At the witness table, Newsom's physical containment protocol had officially collapsed. The signature polished smile that had been his primary political tool since the recall attempt had been completely retired. His face was now locked into a neutral, vacant position. It was the biological equivalent of a professional boxer who had sustained too much cranial trauma and had decided to simply cover up and wait for the bell to end the round. He was absorbing immense structural damage without providing the gallery with the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. But the cameras, which had been trained on his facial geometry since the commencement of the hearing, were documenting a reality that the governor's conscious mind could no longer control. He was no longer a performing politician. He was an individual enduring a public forensic dissection of his entire administrative tenure. He sat motionless, absorbing the factual recitation of his chief of staff's criminal behavior, while the federal record permanently documented that the corruption was not an isolated event occurring in a distant branch of the government. It was occurring directly outside the governor's office door, managed by the person he trusted with his entire public legacy. Trump did not raise his voice to conclude the segment. He simply set the indictment summary down on the mahogany desk, adding it to the growing pile of verified failures. The message was perfectly clear. The collapse of the governor's administration was not a victimless administrative error. It was a pervasive internal culture of systemic abuse that had physically touched every single aspect of the state's executive leadership. The structural audit of the governor's 30-year survival architecture had officially reached its mathematical conclusion. President Trump had successfully extracted the isolated components of multiple state scandals, the $31 billion fraud, the French Laundry hypocrisy, the Panera Bread legislative maneuver, the chief of staff's criminal indictments, and the systemic housing failure, and systematically reassembled them into a single, highly visible machine on the mahogany surface of the committee desk. The final phase of the operation did not require the president to deliver a theatrical closing argument, nor did it require him to aggressively demand a cinematic confession from the witness. In the advanced mechanics of federal cross-examination, demanding a confession fundamentally acknowledges that the interrogator still requires the target's verbal cooperation to validate the evidence. Trump did not require Newsom's cooperation. The gold tab folder had already executed the destruction. He merely needed to initiate the final stress test to empirically demonstrate that the administrative machine was no longer capable of defending itself. He deliberately abandoned the standard legal framework of statutory guilt. He stepped entirely outside of that procedural maze. He abandoned the question of technical compliance, and he prepared the acoustic space of the hearing room to absorb a question that was vastly simpler, substantially broader, and infinitely more lethal. Trump summarized the verified timeline. He stated that for years, the public had been subjected to a continuous sequence of state audits, federal investigations, grand jury indictments, and massive financial losses. However, throughout this entire chronological span, Absolute accountability had never reached the primary individual whose specific nomenclature sat at the absolute center of every single operational storm. Trump did not apply any rhetorical ornamentation to this summary. He delivered it with the mechanical flatness of a technician reading a diagnostic report. He then executed the final maneuver. He leaned forward slightly, locked his visual focus directly onto the governor, and delivered the terminal question. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask whether the legal defense team could provide a technical justification for the anomalies. Trump asked, "Governor, you can't run California. Why should America trust you to run the country?" The immediate silence that descended upon the House chamber did not register as an absence of sound. It registered as a massive physical weight dropping directly onto the witness table. In standard human conversation, a delay of 3 seconds is considered highly uncomfortable. In the highly optimized, broadcast-ready environment of a televised hearing, an extended silence is functionally equivalent to an active act of violence. The primary clock began to tick. The first second passed, then the second, then the third. Gavin Newsom, an individual who had successfully navigated hostile press conferences, aggressive recall attempts, and decades of state-level scrutiny without ever losing control of a room, produced absolutely zero audio. The fourth second, the fifth, the sixth. His facial architecture did not dramatically collapse. A sudden emotional collapse would have allowed the media to pivot the narrative toward human sympathy. Instead, his facial muscles executed a highly rigid mechanical reorganization. The physical tissue around his mouth pressed inward, forming a tight, impenetrable barrier. It was the distinct biological expression of a system rapidly closing every available operational exit because the threat currently standing outside the door had finally spoken the exact correct activation code. The 7th second, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. His hands remained perfectly frozen on the table. Earlier, when the pressure of the audit intensified, his central nervous system had committed a microscopic error, causing his fingers to grip the table edge to seek an anchor. His biological system had permanently logged that error. His body now seemed entirely aware that any physical motion, any attempt to reach for hydration or adjust a microphone would instantly transform into a highly visible, broadcasted admission of severe internal panic. The forced stillness was absolute. 11 seconds, 12. Exactly 12 seconds of total, unbroken silence, a stretch of temporal space so vast and unyielding that the cameras practically recorded the oxygen leaving the room. The silence was heavier than any spoken confession. It provided the American public with something the establishment rigorously prevents, a moment where the absence of a polished answer was mathematically clean enough to be universally understood. Trump nodded slowly. He did not display triumph. He simply exhibited the quiet satisfaction of an auditor who had expected total system failure and had received precisely what he calculated. "Thank you," Trump stated, officially breaking the void. He turned his head toward the committee chairman. Newsom responded because, of course, Newsom responded. His verbal output lasted for exactly 2 minutes and 41 seconds. It was a masterpiece of institutional polish. He executed a highly calibrated rhetorical sequence regarding the fifth largest economy, the state's GDP growth, the national homelessness crisis, and the federal drivers of housing costs. The speech was structurally flawless, and from a forensic standpoint, it was entirely empty. Because during those 2 minutes and 47 seconds, he fundamentally addressed absolutely nothing. He did not address the $31 billion in fraud. He did not address the French Laundry photograph showing indoor dining, while his office claimed outdoor. He did not address the Panera Bread exemption. He did not address the Dana Williamson indictment, the Chanel bag, or the fraudulent pandemic relief claims. Most importantly, he did not dedicate a single syllable to answering the specific question Trump had actually asked. Why should America trust you? Trump did not register a physical reaction to the performance. Reacting would have validated the attempt to reestablish the traditional partisan dynamic. Instead, he simply initiated his extraction sequence. He engaged in the mechanical process of securing his physical evidence. He closed the gold-tabbed folder with the exact same slow, deliberate care he had utilized when he initially opened it. That folder had appeared entirely ordinary at the beginning of the hearing. It now looked like the most dangerous artifact in the United States Capitol because it had carried what years of aggressive shouting had fundamentally failed to carry. It had carried sequence. He stood from the podium. He did not look at the broadcast cameras. He did not look at the hostile witness. He looked directly at the citizens who had sat through the entire diagnostic procedure. He delivered the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. The nonverbal communication was absolute. It confirmed that what a grand political speech would have only served to cheapen, they had all mathematically witnessed together. Sometimes the brand fundamentally does not need to talk, provided the room becomes quiet enough for everyone to clearly hear the suit is empty.